She slammed the ledger shut so hard the lamp shook, and every ranch hand sitting at that table went dead quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because in that single moment, the woman they had spent 3 days laughing at, the round-faced, heavy-framed, overdressed outsider who didn't know how to saddle a horse or rope a calf, looked up from those numbers with eyes that could cut glass and said in a voice so low and steady it stopped the room cold, "This ranch isn't dying from bad luck. Someone's been bleeding it dry, and I'm going to find out who." If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye on you like a wound, then Vivian Mercer's story is yours. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach arrived in Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday, and the town barely looked up. It was the kind of town that had seen enough disappointment to stop getting excited about arrivals. Dust on the main street, weathered storefronts, men with their hats pulled low and their eyes lower. The stage rolled in from the east with a creak and a groan, and when the door swung open, Vivian Mercer stepped down with her single brown suitcase, her good wool traveling dress, and the careful, deliberate posture of a woman who had practiced not flinching. She was 31 years old. She was full-figured in a way that frontier Wyoming had no patience for: broad shoulders, soft arms, a face that the dime novels would have called plain, and the women back home in Ohio had privately called warm. She wore her brown hair pinned back because she had no time for vanity and never had. And she stepped onto the dirt of Harlan's Creek with the legal document folded in her coat pocket that said she was now the wife of one Gideon Hale of the Hale Ranch, 16 miles north of town. She had never met him in person. She had agreed to this arrangement through a broker in Columbus after her father's death left her with no inheritance, no prospects, and a landlord who was already counting the days. The broker had shown her Gideon Hale's letter. A struggling ranch. A man who needed a capable woman to help run a household. A legal arrangement. A chance. She had packed one suitcase because she had learned not to carry what she couldn't afford to lose. The man waiting at the hitching post outside the stage office was not what she expected. Gideon Hale was tall, lean, and weathered the way Wyoming made men, with a jaw like a fence post and eyes the color of cold creek water. He looked at her the way you look at a bill you can't pay. Not with cruelty. Not yet. Just with the flat resignation of a man who had made a practical decision and was now facing its full weight. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He did not tip his hat. He did not smile. "Mr. Hale," she said. She did not extend her hand. She had not come all this way to be refused a handshake in public. He looked at her suitcase, then at her. Then he turned and walked toward the wagon without another word. She picked up her own bag and followed him. They rode those 16 miles in near silence. Gideon Hale had maybe 4 sentences left in him for the day, and he spent them telling her where she'd sleep, that breakfast was at 5, and that the kitchen was her domain. She listened without interrupting. She watched the land. Instead, the way it rolled and opened the dry grass, the sky that went on and on like something that didn't need permission from anyone. She was already thinking. The Hale Ranch came into view at the end of a long dirt track, and her first honest thought was that it was dying. Not dead. Dying. There's a difference, and she had learned to see it. The fencing on the east pasture was down in 3 places. The barn door had a broken hinge. The main house was solid enough, built with good timber, but the garden beside it had been left to go dry and weedy, and the windows needed washing, and the whole property had that particular silence that falls over a place when the people living in it have stopped believing in it. There were 7 ranch hands. They were gathered near the barn when the wagon rolled in, and they watched her step down with the kind of attention that is not kindness. She heard it before she was 3 steps from the wagon. "Lord above." Low voice, followed by a poorly smothered laugh. Gideon ordered himself a wife and got a whole side of beef. More laughter. Not all of them, but enough. She kept walking. She had learned early in life that turning toward cruelty only fed it. You walk forward. You keep your breathing even. You save your energy for what matters. Inside the main house was cold and cluttered with a specific type of masculine neglect. The kitchen was in worse shape than she'd anticipated, a cast-iron stove that needed cleaning, a larder with maybe a week's worth of provisions, and a flour barrel that was barely half full. She set her suitcase down. She put her hands on the edge of the table. She looked at what she had to work with. Then she got to work. She didn't ask anyone for help. She cleaned the kitchen herself. She inventoried what was in the larder down to the last half-pound of dried beans. She rebuilt the fire in the stove and had a proper meal on the table by 6 o'clock that evening. Not the best meal of anyone's life, but solid, hot, and correctly seasoned, which was already more than the ranch hands had seen in a while, based on the speed with which they cleared their plates. Nobody thanked her. Gideon ate with his eyes on the table. The ranch hands ate like men performing an act of reluctant surrender. One of them, a wiry, sun-darkened young man named Cal, who seemed to function as the informal ringleader of opinions, looked at his empty plate and said to nobody in particular, "Decent enough, I suppose, for a woman who looks like she's eaten her share and then some." Quiet laughter. Eyes sliding toward her to see if she'd react. Vivian refilled the breadbasket and said nothing, but she was listening to everything. That was her gift, and it was the kind of gift that looked like nothing from the outside. She listened the way still water listens. She heard what the men said when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She heard what Gideon said on the porch late at night when he thought she was asleep. She heard the worry underneath the hard voices, the fear underneath the indifference. She was building a map, and every careless word was a landmark. By the end of her first week, she knew the following. The ranch carried a debt of $4,000 with a note due in 8 months. The cattle stock was not large enough to generate sufficient revenue to cover that note. The ranch hands were paid irregularly and not well, which meant they were only partly invested in the operation's success. Gideon had tried twice to expand his cattle contracts and failed both times. The last offer he'd received for the herd had been insultingly low below market from a buyer Vivian did not yet know, but was already suspicious of. She also knew this 16 miles to the south, the Wyoming Central Railroad was pushing a new line west through difficult terrain, and they had approximately 400 workers in active camps along the route. She had seen the camps from the ridge on her third morning when she had walked out early before anyone was awake, because she needed to think without walls around her. She thought for a long time on that ridge. Then she went back down and started making lists. The first person she approached was Gideon. She chose a Sunday evening after supper when the hands were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. She spread her notes on the kitchen table, a careful accounting of what she'd observed, what the debt structure looked like, what she believed was possible. Gideon looked at her papers without touching them. "The cattle market is unstable," she said. "A single contract won't save this ranch, not in 8 months, but those railroad camps to the south are feeding 400 men on inadequate provisions. I've spoken to 2 workers who came through town. They're losing workdays to illness and fatigue because the camp food is poor quality and inconsistently supplied. That's a problem, and I know how to solve it." Gideon looked up from the papers. "You want to cook for railroad workers? I want to build a supply operation that feeds railroad workers," she said. "There's a difference. You've been here 10 days. I know. You don't know this land. I know money," she said, "and I know food, and I know that what those men need I can provide. Give me a wagon in 60 days. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze steadily and without apology. She was used to men looking at her like she was a problem to be managed. She waited for him to finish managing her in his mind. "What happens if it doesn't work?" he said. "Then we're in the same position we're in right now," she said, "except 60 days closer to foreclosure. So the question isn't whether we can afford to try. The question is whether we can afford not to." He was quiet. She could see him doing the calculation she had already done. Finally, 1 wagon, 3 weeks. If it doesn't bring in cash by the end of 3 weeks, we don't talk about it again. "Agreed," she said. She did not smile until he had left the room. The next morning she asked Cal, the sharp-tongued one, to hitch the wagon. He made a face like she had suggested something physically offensive. "You want me to hitch it for what exactly?" "I'm going south to the railroad camps." He stared at her. "You're going to the camps?" "Yes." "To do what?" "To sell food." He looked at the other men nearby. The look was eloquent. "Did you hear this? Are you hearing this?" Then he turned back to her. "Ma'am, those are rough men. Work camps aren't exactly—" "I didn't ask for your assessment of the situation," she said pleasantly. "I asked you to hitch the wagon." He hitched the wagon. She loaded it herself mostly. She had spent 2 days preparing dried biscuits, salt pork, dried apple preserves, a large pot of slow-cooked beans she'd started before dawn. She had borrowed against the larder as carefully as she could, calculating what she could afford to sell at what margin. She had written a price list in her small, even handwriting. When she drove the wagon out through the ranch gate, the hands watched in silence. She heard one of them say something she chose not to retain. The first camp foreman was a broad-chested Irishman named Patrick Doyle, who looked at her wagon with the expression of a man who has been offered soup when he expected to be ignored. "What have you got?" he said. "Hot beans, salt pork, biscuits, apple preserves, all made this morning." She handed him a sample biscuit without being asked. He ate it. He was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. She told him. He looked at the wagon. He looked at her. He looked at the line of workers behind him, who had stopped what they were doing to look at the wagon with a very specific expression that she recognized hunger, and not just the physical kind. Hunger for something decent. Something that tasted like a person had made it. "We'll take what you've got," Doyle said. She sold everything in 2 hours. She drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon with cash money in the strongbox and the quiet iron certainty of a woman who has just proved something to herself that she already knew. Cal was in the yard when she pulled in. He looked at the empty wagon. His expression shifted not into anything soft, not yet, but into something that wasn't mockery either. Something more careful. "Sell everything," he said. "Down to the last biscuit," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he took the horses without being asked. She was inside making notes at the kitchen table when Gideon came in an hour later. She showed him the cash without ceremony. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. "That's from one trip," he said. "One trip," she confirmed. "To one camp. There are 7 camps on the current route." He sat down across from her the first time he had sat at this table to talk to her, rather than to eat in front of her, and said quietly, "What do you need?" "More provisions," she said. "And I need to hire someone to drive a second wagon within 30 days. If we move fast and keep the food quality high, we can establish relationships with at least 4 camps before another supplier decides to compete." He was quiet. She watched him absorb it. "The hands," he said. "They're not going to take well to—" "I'm not asking the hands to do anything," she said. "I'm asking you. This is the ranch's operation, Mr. Hale. I'm trying to save it." He met her eyes. And for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Gideon Hale looked at Vivian Mercer without the flat calculation of a man looking at an arrangement he had made. He looked at her the way you look at something you had written off and are now beginning to reconsider carefully, and with the particular shame of having been wrong. "All right," he said. She went back to her lists. Over the next 3 weeks, she made 8 trips to 4 different camps. She learned each foreman's preferences. She adjusted her recipes for volume, scaling up her bean preparations, adding cornbread because it traveled well, introducing a simple dried fruit compote that the men began requesting by name. She tracked every expenditure and every dollar of revenue in her notebook with the precision of an accountant, because she had been her father's bookkeeper from the age of 14, and she knew that the difference between a business and a dream was a ledger that balanced. Word traveled. It always does in work camps. The men moved between sites, ate their meals quickly, and sometimes far from where they'd started the day, and when someone found something decent, they told the others. By the end of the first month, she had a waiting order from a 5th camp. The ranch hand's attitude shifted in the way that attitudes shift when money comes into a place that hasn't had it, not with apology, not with open acknowledgement, but with a gradual reduction in mockery and an increase in the kind of wary respect that men offer when they've been proven wrong about something and would rather not discuss it directly. Cal started hitching the wagon without being asked. One of the older hands, a quiet man named Everett, started loading the supply crates without comment. She didn't ask for their approval. She didn't need it. She needed the ranch to survive, and it was surviving. But she had also found something in the ledgers, something she had noticed in her first week and tracked carefully since then. The original ranch debt had features she didn't recognize from legitimate lending. The interest structure was irregular, in a way that looked designed to grow faster than the ranch could service it. And the name at the bottom of the primary loan agreement was a company she'd spent 3 evenings tracing in the county records she'd quietly obtained from a clerk in town. That company had a parent entity. That parent entity had a director. His name was R. Harlan Voss. She wrote the name in her notebook and underlined it twice. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with that information. But she was Vivian Mercer, and she had a system. And the system said, you find the problem first. You understand it completely. Then you decide what to do about it. She closed the notebook. She walked to the window and looked out at the ranch, the new fence posts Cal had put in on the east pasture, without being asked the barn door that Everett had fixed the garden she'd replanted 2 weeks ago, and that was already showing green shoots in the morning light. It was not yet an empire, but it was no longer dying. And somewhere south of them, along the railroad line pushing west through Wyoming, 400 men sat down to supper and ate food that Vivian Mercer had made, and they worked better for it, and they knew it, and the man whose company had tried to suffocate this ranch into submission had not yet noticed what was being built in the quiet. He would. The name R. Harlan Voss sat in Vivian's notebook like a splinter she hadn't yet decided whether to remove. She didn't move on it immediately. That was not how she worked. She had learned from her father, a man who lost everything twice, because he moved before he understood that the most dangerous thing a person in a weak position could do was strike before they had the full picture. So she kept the name where it was kept her eyes open and kept her wagons rolling south. The 5th camp came on a Wednesday. The foreman there was a different kind of man than Doyle Younger, suspicious with the particular hostility of someone who has been sold promises before and learned to treat kindness as a prelude to disappointment. His name was Garrett Webb, and he stood in front of his crew with his arms crossed when her wagon rolled in, and he said, before she had even climbed down from the seat, "We don't need charity." Good. Vivian said, climbing down anyway. Because I'm not offering any. I'm offering food at fair market price delivered on schedule, quality guaranteed. If you don't want it, I'll turn around and sell it to Camp 3, which has been asking me for double the volume I can currently provide. Webb stared at her. She had noticed that men often stared at her as a form of pressure, as if sustained eye contact would eventually cause her to retreat into apology. She had never once retreated into apology. She waited. "What kind of food?" he said. "Hot beans, cornbread, salt pork, dried apple compote on Fridays." One of the workers behind him, a young man with a bandaged hand and the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, said quietly, "Boss, I heard about her food from the boys at Camp 3. Webb didn't turn around, but something shifted in his jaw. What did they say? They said it was real. That was all he said. It was real. Vivian understood what the young man meant, and it landed somewhere in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. These men ate food every day that barely qualified as sustenance. Nutrition stripped to its minimum flavor, and afterthought dignity not considered at all. And somewhere down the line, someone had told someone else that what Vivian Mercer made tasted like a person had actually made it. Like someone had stood over a fire and cared about the outcome. Webb uncrossed his arms. "Set up over there," he said. She sold out again in under 90 minutes. On the drive back, she ran the numbers in her head without paper because she had long ago trained herself to do that, to carry figures the way other people carried grudges, close and accessible, and never quite out of mind. She was at the outer edge of what her current supply chain could support. She needed more flour, more salt pork, a consistent source of dried apples, and she needed another driver because she could not be in 2 places at once, and the fifth camp had just demonstrated that she could absolutely move twice the volume she was currently producing. She also needed to deal with Gideon. Not because Gideon was a problem he had in the 6 weeks since she had first laid her plan on the kitchen table become something unexpected. He was not warm. He was not demonstrative. But he had stopped treating her like furniture, and that was worth acknowledging. He asked questions now. Real questions about her route schedule, about the foreman's preferences, about which camps were expanding and which were winding down. He listened to her answers with the focus of a man who has realized belatedly that he has been standing next to a resource he had dismissed. But he was still carrying something she hadn't fully seen yet. Something underneath the practical conversations, the careful respect. She could hear it in the pauses, in the way he sometimes looked at the ranch at dusk, like a man measuring the distance between where he was and where he had once expected to be. She would deal with that when she understood it better. First things first, she pulled into the ranch yard as the light was going gold, and before she had tied off the horses, she called out to Cal. He appeared from the barn with a look that had become, over these weeks, something she privately categorized as cautious cooperation. "I need a second driver," she said. "Starting next week. Someone who can handle a wagon on rough terrain and keep his mouth shut about routes and prices." Cal wiped his hands on his trousers. "Everett's your man," he said without hesitation. She raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected him to answer that quickly or that directly. "He used to do supply runs for the Army," Cal said, "before he came here. He knows those roads better than anyone, and he doesn't talk." "Send him to find me after supper," she said. Cal nodded. Then, in the careful way of a man editing himself in real time, he said, "The boys have been talking." She waited. "About the money coming in." He stopped, started again. "I know it's not really any of our business what you—" "It's absolutely your business," she said. "This is your ranch too. The money coming in is going toward the debt. If the debt gets cleared, everyone who works here keeps working here. That is directly your business." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "How close are we?" She had the number ready. 7 months out, we were looking at foreclosure. At current revenue, I've moved that to 5 months out. In 30 days, if I open 2 more camps and hold volume, I can move it to manageable. That's the goal. He was quiet. Then, "All right." He walked back to the barn without the drawling edge she had grown accustomed to. That was new. She noted it without making more of it than it was. Everett agreed to drive the second wagon without drama, which was entirely consistent with his character. He was a man of approximately 50, who had worked the Hale Ranch for 11 years, and had, in Vivian's observation, the particular stillness of someone who has survived enough difficulty to stop being startled by new versions of it. He listened to her instructions, asked 2 practical questions about weight distribution and preferred road conditions, and showed up the following Monday at 5 in the morning with the wagon hitched and the first supply load already checked against the list she had written out the night before. She felt something shift, small but real, when she looked at that loaded wagon in the pre-dawn dark and understood that she was no longer working alone. 2 wagons meant 2 simultaneous routes. She ran the numbers again. With proper production scaling starting the night before, working in organized batches, rather than sequential preparations, she could supply 6 camps within a fortnight. 6 camps meant consistent daily revenue that, combined with the ranch's existing cattle operation, put them inside striking distance of the debt note with months to spare. She told Gideon on a Thursday evening. She laid the projection out in plain figures. He studied the numbers for a long time without speaking. "This is real," he said, "not a question." "It's conservative," she said. "I've built in a 20% reduction for days when weather or camp movement disrupts the route. Even with that buffer, the projection holds." He looked up from the paper. Vivian. It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it the way she registered most things, quietly, precisely, without display. "You could have shown me this 2 months ago," he said. "I didn't have the data 2 months ago," she said. "I had a theory. Now I have proof." He nodded slowly. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not quite regret, but close to it. The look of a man doing arithmetic on time he can't get back. "The hands still," he started. "The hands have been fine," she said, which was not entirely the full truth, but was true enough in the direction that mattered. The mockery had thinned to almost nothing. What remained was a kind of watchful deference that she neither needed nor sought, but that she recognized as functional. They worked alongside her operation without sabotaging it, and for now, that was enough. Then Gideon said something that reordered everything she thought she understood about this ranch. He said it quietly, looking at the table rather than at her with the specific restraint of a man who has been holding a sentence for a long time and finally just let it go. "The original debt wasn't from bad management," he said. "I need you to know that, because I can see you looking at those numbers, and I know what you're thinking." She kept very still. "My father built this ranch from nothing," he said. "When he died, I inherited it in good standing, no significant debt, good cattle stock. 3 years ago, I tried to expand, bought new grazing land to the north, took out a loan to finance it. The loan was offered to me by a land company out of Cheyenne. The terms seemed straightforward." He stopped. "They weren't." "The interest structure," she said. He looked up sharply. "I've been looking at the original loan agreement," she said. "The interest compounds in a way that isn't standard. It's structured to prevent the principal from being meaningfully reduced, regardless of payment volume. I've been trying to identify who benefits from that structure." The silence that followed was very complete. "R. Harlan Voss," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know." "You found him." "I found the company chain. Last week I found the director's name." She paused. "What do you know about him?" Gideon set his hands flat on the table. It was a gesture she had come to recognize as him bracing himself against something. "He's been buying land along the proposed railroad extension route for 3 years. Small ranches mostly. He gets them into debt through loan companies he controls, then forecloses when they can't pay. The railroad pays him top price for right-of-way land. It's clean, it's legal, and it's been happening all the way from Laramie to the Wyoming border." Vivian said nothing for a moment. She was pulling threads together: the debt structure, the low offer Gideon had received for his cattle last year, the loan company's unusual patience with late payments that she had initially found puzzling, and now understood perfectly. Voss wasn't in a hurry, because a hurried foreclosure looked like predation. A slow one looked like failure. "He's waiting us out," she said. "He's been waiting 3 years," Gideon said. "He owns the note. If we miss the payment in 8 months, we won't miss it," she said. He looked at her. "Vivian, we will not miss it," she said again with the quiet authority of someone who is not making a promise so much as stating a fact that hasn't happened yet. "But I need to understand something. The railroad camp workers I'm supplying, who currently holds their supply contract—" Gideon went still. "What? The food supply contract for the Wyoming Central Railroad camps. Who holds it?" He blinked, thinking. "I don't know exactly. There was some Cheyenne company that—" He stopped, and she watched him arrive at the same place she had arrived at 2 days ago when she had thought to ask that exact question and had spent 2 evenings tracing the answer through the county business registry. "It's Voss," he said, flat, like something hitting the ground. "It's a subsidiary," she said. 3 companies removed. But yes, the existing supply contract for the railroad camps is controlled by a company that Voss has a majority stake in. The contract provides for basic provisions. It's the minimum required under the railroad agreement. She paused. "It's also based on what every single foreman I've dealt with has told me completely inadequate. Which is why those men are sick, underperforming, and buying from me instead." Gideon stared at her. "He structured the debt to take this ranch," she said. "And the same network controls the food supply contract that I've been quietly replacing camp by camp for the past 6 weeks." She let that sit for a moment. "He doesn't know that yet, but he will." Gideon was on his feet without seeming to have decided to stand. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, Not anger exactly, though there was that, but something older and more corrosive. The humiliation of a man who has been outmaneuvered over years and is only now understanding the geometry of it. "He'll come after us," Gideon said. "Yes," she said, "which is why we need to move faster than we were planning." He turned around. "How much faster?" 6 camps within 3 weeks instead of a month. Full volume at each one. I want those foremen dependent on our supply chain before Voss realizes what's happening. Once the relationships are established and the men are relying on our food, breaking those contracts becomes a labor problem for the railroad, not just a business decision. She met his eyes. "And I need you to make one trip to Laramie." "For what?" "There's a lawyer there, a man named Clarence Adler. He specializes in railroad land contracts and has a reputation for being difficult to intimidate. I need him to look at the original loan agreement." She had written his name down 3 weeks ago after hearing it mentioned by a county clerk who had seemed for just a moment to want to say more than he did. "I think there may be language in that loan structure that isn't just predatory. I think it may be fraudulent. And if it is, then we have a different kind of weapon," Gideon said. "Then we're not just building an operation," she said. "We're building a case." He absorbed that, nodded. Then, with the directness of a man who has just decided to stop being embarrassed and start being useful. "When do I leave team?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll write out what to show him." She stayed up that night making notes. She wrote quickly, organizing everything she had found. The loan agreement anomalies, the subsidiary structure, the timeline of Voss's land acquisitions, the connection to the supply contracts. She wrote it in clear sequential language because a lawyer would need it clear, and a jury, if it came to that, would need it sequential. When she finally put down her pen, it was past midnight. The house was quiet. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch at night, the horses in the paddock, the faint creak of the bunkhouse. She thought about Voss. She thought about the architecture of what he had built, elegant in its way and deeply cold. A system designed to look like ordinary commerce while functioning as a machine for dispossessing men like Gideon, who worked hard and believed in straightforward dealing and never thought to look 3 companies deep into who held their loan. She thought about the fact that he had been doing this for 3 years and nobody had stopped him. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, "What does he not know about us?" She answered her own question in point form. He did not know the full extent of her supply penetration into the camps. He did not know about the lawyer. He did not know that she had the loan agreement, or that she had read it 6 times and underlined 11 clauses that she believed a qualified attorney would find actionable. He did not know that she had spent the last 3 weeks quietly cultivating relationships with 3 of the most influential foremen on the Wyoming Central route, men who now knew her name and ate her food, and would take her call if she needed to send a message fast. He thought he was watching a drowning ranch take on a little water from a new direction. He did not yet know that she was building a wall. She kept the next 2 weeks at a pace that should have been unsustainable, but was not, because she had the particular energy of a person who has identified exactly what needs to be done and refuses to be distracted from it. She and Everett ran parallel routes every day, except Sunday. She was up at 3 in the morning to begin production, and she did not sit down between 3 and noon except to drive the wagon. She memorized every foreman's name, their crew sizes, their scheduling quirks. She built a system of advance orders. Each camp told her 3 days ahead of time if their numbers were changing, which let her adjust production without waste. Camp 6 came on, then 7. The volume was now significant enough that she needed to bring in supplies from Laramie rather than relying on Harlan's Creek's small general store, which could not keep up with her flour orders. She negotiated a wholesale arrangement with a Laramie supplier by letter, offering consistent weekly orders in exchange for a reduced price per unit. The supplier agreed within 4 days. The ranch hands had by this point completed a transition she had not formally acknowledged, but privately charted. Cal had become, without anyone naming it as such, the de facto ranch-side coordinator for her operation, managing wagon maintenance, helping with loading when they were short on time, liaising with the supply deliveries from Laramie. Everett drove his route with the unflappable precision of a man who takes pride in doing a thing correctly, regardless of whether anyone notices. Two of the other hands had started helping with early morning prep in the kitchen, not because she had asked them, but because the operation had grown to the point where the work simply needed doing, and they were there. She did not make it sentimental. She thanked them practically in the language they understood. "You saved us 45 minutes this morning. That's 2 extra stops on the north route." They worked harder after that. Gideon returned from Laramie on a Friday afternoon. She was in the kitchen doing the production run for the following day when she heard his horse in the yard. She kept working. She heard him come inside, heard him stop in the doorway. She did not turn around. "Adler looked at it," he said. She set down her spoon, turned. Gideon's face was doing something complicated, anger relief and the particular raw expression of a man who has just been told that the thing that happened to him was not his fault, which is sometimes harder to absorb than the thing itself. "He said the compounding clause is fraudulent under Wyoming territorial law," Gideon said. "The loan agreement contains a provision that was written in a way specifically designed to obscure the effective interest rate. Adler said he's seen this structure 3 times in the last 4 years. All 3 involved the same parent company." He stopped. "He said, if we can demonstrate a pattern, we have grounds for a civil case." Vivian breathed out slowly. "He wants copies of everything you've compiled," Gideon said. "He also said—" He stopped again. She waited. "He said whoever documented all of this knew what they were doing." She picked up her spoon. "Tell him we'll have copies in Laramie by Tuesday." Gideon didn't move from the doorway. She could feel him looking at her, and she recognized the quality of the attention. It was not the blank calculation from the stagecoach, not the wary reassessment of the past months. This was something else. Something quieter and more careful. "Vivian," he said. She turned again because something in his voice required it. "I want you to know," he said, "that when I agreed to this arrangement, the marriage, I was thinking about the ranch, about the debt. I wasn't thinking about—" He stopped, reorganized. "I wasn't thinking about you as a person. I want you to know that I understand what I did, and Gideon." She said it gently but firmly, the way you stop someone from walking off a ledge. "I didn't come here because I thought you would value me. I came here because I needed a place to work, and this place needed work done. We were both practical. There's no debt between us on that account." He looked at her steadily. And now, she held his gaze. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but this specific question, in this specific moment, required honesty she hadn't fully organized yet. "Now we have a ranch to save," she said, "and after that we'll see what we are." It was not a promise, and it was not a rejection. He understood that. He nodded once the way a man nods when he's been answered fairly, and went to wash up for supper. That night she sat on the porch alone after everyone had gone to sleep. She had her notebook open, but she wasn't writing. She was thinking about Voss, about the fact that they were now 6 weeks into a revenue stream that was actively displacing his subsidiaries' camp supply contracts, and about the fact that in 6 weeks she had not heard a single word from him or any representative of his interests. Which meant either he hadn't noticed, or he was watching and waiting for something specific. She thought about which of those possibilities worried her more, and concluded after some time that it was the second one. She thought about what she would do when he moved, because he would move. A man who had built a 3-year predatory land scheme did not simply accept competition in his supply contracts and go quietly about his business. He would eventually look south toward the railroad camps, and he would trace the supply displacement back to its source, and when he did, he would find the Hale Ranch, and when he found the Hale Ranch, he would find her. She wanted to be ready. She closed the notebook and went inside and got 3 hours of sleep before the production run started again at 3 in the morning. 2 days later, on a clear Wyoming morning, with winter starting to make itself felt at the edges of the wind, a man rode into the ranch yard in a coat that was too expensive for the dust he was riding through. He had a wide-brimmed hat and the flat assessing eyes of a man who has learned to calculate value quickly and finds the process pleasurable. He did not ask for Gideon. He asked for the woman running the food operation. Cal came and found her in the kitchen. His expression told her something was different before he opened his mouth. "Man outside," he said. "Dressed too well for a ranch call. He's got a card." He held it out. She wiped her hands, took the card, read it. The name on the card was not Voss. It was a name she didn't recognize a representative. A messenger in a good coat. She had known this was coming. She set the card down on the table, smoothed her apron, and walked outside into the cold morning air to meet whatever came next. The man in the expensive coat turned when he heard her come out. He looked at her with the practiced neutrality of a professional who has learned not to let surprise show on his face. He almost succeeded. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "What can I do for you?" He smiled the way people smile when the smile is a tool. "My employer would like to speak with you," he said, "at your earliest convenience. He's prepared to make your operation a very generous offer." She looked at him steadily. "Tell your employer," she said, "that my operation is not for sale, but I'd be delighted to meet with him if he'd like to discuss the railroad camp supply contracts. I have some thoughts about how those could be restructured." The man's smile stayed on his face, but stopped reaching his eyes. "I'll pass that along," he said. "You do that," she said. She watched him ride out. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen, because she had 300 portions of cornbread to finish before dawn, and an empire that was not yet done being built. The messenger in the expensive coat came back 4 days later. This time he didn't ride in alone. There were 2 men with him. Quiet, wide-shouldered men who stayed on their horses and watched the yard with the practiced stillness of people hired specifically to be noticed. It was a message before any words were spoken. Vivian recognized the grammar of it immediately. She had grown up around men who used physical presence as punctuation, and she had learned early that the only correct response was to refuse to read it. She was already outside when they rode in, because Cal had seen them coming up the track and had the good sense to find her before they arrived. She stood in the yard with her hands loose at her sides and her expression doing nothing in particular. The messenger dismounted. He did not smile this time. "My employer would prefer a direct meeting," he said. "He's in Harlan's Creek through the end of the week." "Then your employer knows where I am," she said. "If he wants to make the ride, he's welcome to it." The messenger looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved just briefly involuntarily to the 2 men behind him, and then back to her. It was the smallest possible signal, and she read it perfectly. He was embarrassed. He had expected this visit to be easier than it was turning out to be, and his employer was going to hear about it, and he was already trying to calculate how to frame the conversation. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. And there was a new quality in his voice now, something tighter, the pleasant surface beginning to show the pressure underneath it. "I want to be clear that this is a generous offer. Not everyone in your position has received one." "I appreciate that," she said pleasantly. "Give Mr. Voss my regards." The messenger's neutral face cracked just fractionally. She hadn't used Voss's name until now. She had let him believe up to this moment that she was working with partial information, that she saw a well-dressed representative but didn't know the architecture above him. Now, he knew she knew. And he could not go back to Voss and pretend otherwise. She watched him recalibrate in real time. He mounted his horse with more efficiency than grace and turned back down the track without another word. The 2 wide-shouldered men followed. Cal appeared beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "You just made him angry," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that smart?" "Probably not," she said. "But it was necessary. He needed to know that I know. Now he has to decide whether to come himself or escalate in another direction. Either way, I find out which kind of man he is." She turned back toward the kitchen. "I've been dealing with partial information. I need him to move so I can see more of the board." Cal looked at her sideways. "You're using yourself as bait." "I prefer to think of it as a diagnostic tool," she said. He made a sound that, coming from Cal, was as close to a laugh as she had ever heard. Harlan Voss arrived at the Hale Ranch 3 days later, and he was not what she had pictured. She had imagined someone who looked the part of a predator, sharp, cold, theatrical in his menace. What stepped off the horse in her yard was a man of about 60, with a round, pleasant face, and the kind of easy warmth that made people trust him before they had a reason to. He was well-fed and well-dressed without being ostentatious about it. He had the manner of a man who has spent decades being underestimated by nobody because nobody underestimates men who look like him. Men who look like him get trusted. They get invited in. They get the keys handed to them by people who never see the hand that reaches for the lock. He looked around the ranch yard with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He looked at the repaired fencing, the clean barn, the 2 wagons parked and loaded for tomorrow's routes. Then he looked at her. She saw at the flicker, the fraction of a second where his assessment recalibrated. She had dealt with enough powerful men to recognize the specific micro-expression of one who has arrived prepared for a certain kind of opponent and found something different. Not dismissal. He was too experienced for that. Just adjustment. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his voice was warm as a hearthstone in January. "What a remarkable operation you've built here." "Mr. Voss," she said, "can I offer you coffee?" She had decided to bring him inside because a conversation in the yard is a conversation with an audience, and she wanted this one contained. She poured coffee without ceremony and sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where she had first laid her supply projections for Gideon, where she had compiled the loan documents for Adler, where she had spent 300 pre-dawn mornings, building everything that Voss was now sitting 3 feet away from. He looked around the kitchen. He was cataloging the way she cataloged. She let him. "I'll be direct," he said, setting down his cup. "I've been watching what you've built over the past 2 months with genuine admiration. You've done something I wouldn't have believed possible. You've moved into an established supply relationship with the Wyoming Central camps and replaced it camp by camp with something better. That takes intelligence. That takes discipline." He smiled. "I respect both." "Thank you," she said. "Which is why," he continued the warmth, staying perfectly calibrated, "I'd like to make you an offer that reflects that respect. I'm prepared to purchase your supply operation, outright equipment contracts, supplier relationships at a price that would clear this ranch's debt with significant remainder. You and your husband would walk away free and clear. No more debt, no more obligation." He paused. "It's a generous offer, Mrs. Mercer, genuinely." She looked at him across the table. She let the silence run for exactly long enough that he couldn't tell whether she was tempted. "And if I decline?" she said. The warmth stayed in place, but something behind his eyes went very flat. "Well," he said, "I certainly wouldn't want to see a promising operation run into avoidable difficulties." "What kind of difficulties?" she said. "Supply routes require access agreements," he said. "Camp foremen report to railroad management. Railroad management responds to its major contractors." He spread his hands in a gesture of gentle helplessness. "I'd hate to see your access to the camps become complicated." She nodded slowly, as though absorbing this, as though it was new information. "I see," she said. "Mr. Voss, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course. How many ranches have you foreclosed on in the last 3 years using the loan structure you placed on this property?" The room went very quiet. Voss looked at her. The warm face was still warm, the way a coal stays warm after the fire above it has gone out. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "I think you are," she said. "The compound interest clause in the loan agreement this ranch carries is not standard. Clarence Adler in Laramie, you may know him, has identified it as potentially fraudulent under Wyoming territorial law. He's currently looking at documentation on 3 other properties in this county that carried the same clause through the same loan company." She paused. "The same parent company." Voss was very still. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you," she said, which was not entirely true, but was strategically useful to say. "I'm telling you because I think you came here expecting a woman who built a food business out of desperation and got lucky. And I'd rather you know who you're actually dealing with before you make any decisions about access agreements and foremen." The silence after that was long and different from the one before it. Then Voss did something she hadn't entirely predicted. He laughed. It was genuine surprise out of him, and it changed his face in a way that the professional warmth had not. He looked for a moment like an actual human being. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you are not what I expected." "I never am," she said. He stood. He buttoned his coat with deliberate care. He looked at her steadily, and what she saw in his face now was not the predatory patience she had been tracking for months. It was something colder and more immediate. "I'll need to speak with my attorneys," he said. "Of course," she said. "Don't expand further while we're in conversation," he said. It was not a request. "I'll take that under advisement," she said, which was not a promise. He left. She stood at the window and watched him ride out, his two wide men flanking him, the posture of his back telling her nothing, because men like Voss had trained their bodies to say nothing. She stayed at the window for a full 2 minutes after he was out of sight. Then she walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and wrote 4 words in her notebook. "He will move fast." She was right. It took 6 days. The first sign was Garrett Webb Camp 5, the suspicious foreman who had softened into one of her most consistent customers. He came to the ranch himself, which he had never done before, arriving in the late afternoon, with his hat in his hands, and an expression that told her everything before he said a word. "They told us we can't accept outside supply deliveries," he said. "Came down from railroad management this morning. Camp policy effective immediately." He looked at her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. I tried to push back. They weren't interested in hearing it." She thanked him. She kept her face neutral until he left. Then she walked to the barn and found Cal, and she said very quietly, "How many camps have you heard from today?" He looked at her. 3 riders came through while you were inside. I was going to tell you at supper." All 3 with the same message. All 3 with the same message. She nodded. She stood in the barn entrance and did the arithmetic. Voss had not come after her operation surgically. He had not tried to pull 1 or 2 camps out from under her to test her response. He had moved simultaneously across the network. He had spoken to railroad management at the top, gotten the policy change issued from above, and let it cascade down to every camp foreman at the same moment. It was a good move. She would have done the same thing. By the following morning, she had heard from all 7 camps. The message was identical at every stop. Vivian Mercer's wagons were no longer welcome. The ranch went quiet in a way that had its own weight. Not the ordinary quiet of a working morning, but the specific silence of a place where the engine has stopped. No pre-dawn production run. No Everett hitching his wagon. No Cal hauling supply crates. The kitchen, which had been running at volume for 2 months, sat still. Gideon found her at the kitchen table, with her notebook open and her coffee untouched. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The scope of the lockout, the timeline, the mechanism. She watched his jaw tighten and held up one hand, just slightly, just enough. "I expected this," she said. "Not the exact shape of it. But I knew when he left here that he would move, and I knew it would be comprehensive. He's not a man who does things halfway. Vivian without the camp revenue. I know what the numbers look like without the camp revenue," she said. "I've known those numbers since I first opened that ledger." "Don't tell me the numbers." He stopped. "I need 3 days," she said. "Can you give me 3 days before we talk about what happens next?" He looked at her at the set of her shoulders. The steadiness of her eyes, the notebook in front of her, that he knew contained more information than most accountants carried in their heads, and he said, "All right." She had actually needed 2 days to think of it. The 3rd day she spent writing the letter. The Pacific Meridian Railroad was Voss's competition. She had known about them for 6 weeks, had tracked their proposed Wyoming route, which ran 20 miles north of the Wyoming Central Line, and was scheduled to begin active construction within the year. She had noted them in her research as a potential future opportunity and filed that thought for later. Later was now. She knew what Pacific Meridian needed: a supply infrastructure already tested in the field, with established relationships with the kind of foremen who influenced worker productivity in a territory they were about to enter. She knew what she had: exactly that. 2 wagons. A supplier relationship in Laramie. A track record documented in her notebook by the day and by the dollar of measurable improvement in worker performance at every camp she had supplied. She wrote the letter to Pacific Meridian's regional operations director, a man named Samuel Grath, whose name she had found in a Laramie newspaper article about the proposed northern route. She wrote it in 4 pages, precise, factual, and structured like a legal argument, which it was, in a sense, a case for why Pacific Meridian should offer her an exclusive supply contract for their Wyoming construction camps before anyone else did. She sent it by telegraph relay because the mail was too slow and she did not have time to be slow. Then she waited. Waiting was its own discipline. She had never been good at stillness, not the passive kind, so she converted the waiting into action she could control. She audited the ranch's cattle situation with Gideon and identified 3 sales he could accelerate to bring in near-term cash. She wrote a second letter to Adler with updated documentation on the loan fraud research because the legal situation had not paused just because everything else had. She reorganized the kitchen supplies with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who does not know how long they need to last. Cal found her in the larder on the second morning moving flour sacks with the kind of energy that is not really about flour sacks. "You know what you're doing," he said, not a question. She stopped, looked at him. Cal, who had called her livestock the day she arrived, who had handed her a horse's opinion of her worth. On her first evening stood in the larder doorway with something in his expression that she had no category for until she recognized it belief. Not the grudging respect she had seen building over months. Something cleaner and more decided. "I know what I'm trying to do," she said. "There's a difference. Everett and I talked," he said. "The other boys too. If it comes to it, if things go wrong, we're not leaving. I want you to know that. Whatever comes next, we're not walking off this ranch." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the man who had made the livestock comment, and she thought about this man, and she thought about the distance between those 2 people. And it occurred to her that she had not been the only one building something on this ranch over the past 2 months. "Thank you, Cal," she said. He nodded once and left. She stood in the larder for a moment longer than she needed to. On the 3rd day, Gideon came to find her at mid-morning with a look she had not seen on him before, urgent and stripped of the careful management he usually kept over his own face. "There's a rider from town," he said. "Telegraph office sent him out." She was already moving toward the door. The rider was a boy of about 16 who handed her the telegram envelope with the solemn efficiency of someone who understands that what he's carrying matters even if he doesn't know why. She opened it. She read it twice. She was careful about her face. Then she handed it to Gideon. He read it. His hands were very still on the paper. "They want a meeting," he said. "Tuesday," she said. "Laramie." He looked up. "In 6 days." "In 6 days," she confirmed. He was quiet. She could see him running the numbers, the timeline, the cash position, what 6 days meant against the revenue they'd lost. "If they say no," he started. "Then we use the Adler case and the accelerated cattle sales, and we fight the foreclosure in court, and we lose 6 months of our lives to legal proceedings," she said calmly. "But they're not going to say no. A company about to build 20 miles of railroad through Wyoming that has no food supply infrastructure, and a competitor who does not want them to succeed, is not going to say no to a proven operator who walked in the door offering to solve that problem." She took the telegram back. Folded it. "They're going to say yes." She said it the way she said everything she believed completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular flat certainty of someone who has done the arithmetic so many times that the answer has stopped feeling like a prediction and started feeling like a memory of something that already happened. Gideon looked at her, the creekwater eyes, the careful face. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what? Stay that calm." She thought about it honestly. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm focused. There's a difference. Calm is when you're not afraid. Focused is when you're afraid, but you know which direction to point it." He held her gaze. She let him. "I'm coming to Laramie with you," he said. It wasn't a question. She considered whether she wanted to argue the point and decided she didn't. "All right," she said. "We leave Monday." She spent the days between writing. She expanded her proposal into a full operations document: supply capacity, route infrastructure, supplier relationships, worker productivity metrics. From each camp she had served, presented in the clean sequential language she had developed for Adler and adapted here for a railroad executive audience. She included the documentation on Wyoming Central's inadequate supply performance. She included her cost projections for the northern route camps, built conservatively on her existing cost structure and scaled for the volume Pacific Meridian would require. She did not sleep more than 4 hours any night between the telegram and Monday morning. On Sunday evening, Gideon sat down across from her at the kitchen table, always the same table, the geography of every important conversation they had ever had, and said, "I want to tell you something before tomorrow." She set down her pen. "When I took out that loan," he said, "I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing for the ranch, for the legacy my father left. I wasn't careless. I wasn't foolish. I was just—" He stopped. "I trusted the wrong person because I didn't know there were people who built systems specifically designed to destroy what other people built. I didn't know that was something a person could choose to be." He was quiet. "You knew. You walked in here and you knew inside of 2 weeks. I've seen it before," she said. "Different form, same architecture." "That's what I mean." He put his hands on the table, that bracing gesture she had come to know. "You've been carrying this whole thing. The plan, the documentation, the Adler letters, the Pacific Meridian proposal. You've been carrying all of it, and I—" He stopped again. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "You let me work," she said. "You gave me the first wagon. You made the Laramie trip. You trusted the numbers without fully understanding them yet. Those things mattered." She paused. "A woman in my position does not need a man to be extraordinary. She needs him to stay out of the way and be honest. You've done both." He was very still. "That's not nothing," she said. The silence that followed was the warmest thing that had lived in this kitchen since she arrived. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with declaration. Just a hand over a hand on a Sunday night in a kitchen that had been the engine room of something neither of them had fully imagined when it started. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while. Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming grass, and the horses settled in the paddock, and somewhere to the south, Harlan Voss sat in whatever comfortable room he occupied and believed he had already won. He did not know about Tuesday. He did not know about Samuel Grath of the Pacific Meridian Railroad, who had received a 4-page proposal unlike anything that had crossed his desk in his 15 years of operations work, and who had telegraphed back in 3 days, not 3 weeks, because he recognized the thing he was reading for what it was. He did not know that Vivian Mercer had already built the wall. He thought he had stopped her. He had only made her faster. Monday morning, she and Gideon hitched the wagon before dawn. She had her document portfolio, everything organized, indexed, copied twice because she had learned never to have only one version of something important. She had her notebook. She had the telegram. She had 4 years of her father's bookkeeping lessons and 6 months of frontier mathematics and 2 months of proving camp by camp and dollar by dollar what she was capable of. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. Cal and Everett were in the yard, the other hands behind them. Nobody spoke, but Cal raised one hand as she drove through the gate and Everett took off his hat, and she felt the weight of it not sentimentally, but truly. The weight of being believed in by people who had once believed the worst. The road to Laramie was long and cold, and she spent most of it working through the proposal in her head. Possible questions, possible objections. The specific numbers she needed Grath to understand, and the specific language that would make him understand them. She rehearsed the way she had always rehearsed, silently, completely in the architecture of her own mind where nobody could hear it and nobody could interrupt. Gideon drove and didn't speak, which was exactly what she needed. At some point in the late morning, he said quietly without taking his eyes off the road, "Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, I want you to know that this ranch is yours as much as mine. Whatever it was before you came here, that's not what it is now." She looked at him. "I should have said that a long time ago," he said. "You're saying it now," she said. He nodded. She turned back to the road ahead. The meeting with Samuel Grath was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 in the morning in the Pacific Meridian field office on Laramie's Main Street. She had one night to sleep, which she mostly didn't, and one morning to walk in there and make the case that would either save everything or change the shape of the catastrophe. She was ready. She had been ready since the moment she stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan's Creek with a single brown suitcase and decided in the dust and the mockery that she was not here to survive. She was here to build. Samuel Grath was not what she expected either, and Vivian had reached the point in her life where she had stopped being surprised by that. The people who mattered were rarely what you pictured. He was younger than his title suggested, perhaps 45, with a precise, economical way of moving that told her he had spent years making decisions under time pressure and had learned to waste nothing, not motion, not words, not attention. He stood when she and Gideon entered the Pacific Meridian field office, and he shook her hand first before Gideon's, which told her something important about how he had read her letter. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "please sit down. I've been looking forward to this conversation since Tuesday." She set her document portfolio on the table. She did not open it immediately. She had learned that the first minutes of any important meeting were about reading the room, not filling it. "You responded quickly," she said. "Your letter was unusual," he said. He sat across from her. He had her 4-page proposal in front of him, annotated in pencil. She could see the marks from where she sat. A man who read with a pencil was a man who was actually reading. "In 15 years of operations work, I've received perhaps 3 proposals that told me something I didn't already know. Yours was structured like a legal brief and read like someone who has actually worked the problem from inside it." "I have," she said. "Tell me about the Wyoming Central situation," he said. "Not the version in the letter. The version you didn't put in writing." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. This was a test not of her honesty, but of her judgment. He wanted to know if she understood the difference between what you document and what you say out loud. "R. Harlan Voss controls the supply contracts for Wyoming Central's active camps through a subsidiary 3 companies removed from his personal holdings," she said. "He also controls the loan note on the ranch my husband owns through a separate loan company operating in Cheyenne. The interest structure on that loan has been identified as potentially fraudulent by Clarence Adler, who is currently building a case that may involve multiple properties across 3 Wyoming counties." She paused. "Voss shut my access to the Wyoming Central camps 8 days ago by having a blanket policy change issued from railroad management level. It was comprehensive and simultaneous, which tells you something about his relationship with Wyoming Central's upper management." Grath leaned back in his chair. "That tells me something about our competition's approach to vendor relationships," he said. "It should," she said. "It also tells you that if you offer me an exclusive supply contract for your northern route camps, Voss will know within a week, and he will attempt to interfere." Grath nodded slowly. "And you're telling me this because I'm not interested in surprises," she said. "And I don't think you are either. I'd rather you hear it from me now than discover it later and wonder why I didn't say anything." He studied her for a long moment. She let him. Then he opened the proposal to page 3, the productivity metrics page, the one she had spent the most time on, the one that translated camp-level food quality directly into measurable labor output across every site she had served. "These numbers," he said, "the productivity improvement figures." "Conservative," she said. "I've built in a 30% discount from the actual observations. Every foreman I supplied will corroborate them if contacted directly. You have foreman references, 7 of them, names and current locations in the appendix." She opened her portfolio and slid a single additional page across the table. "I also have a written statement from Patrick Doyle at Camp 1, who was the first foreman I supplied and has the longest data record. He wrote it voluntarily. I didn't ask him to include the last paragraph." Grath read the page. The last paragraph she knew it by memory, because she had read it herself 4 times, and each time it had done something to her chest she hadn't expected. Doyle had written in his direct, unliterary way, "I've worked construction camps for 22 years, and I've never seen a food supplier who understood that feeding men is." Mrs. Mercer understood that on her first visit and never forgot it. "My crew works differently when they've eaten her food. I don't know how to explain that in numbers, but I know it when I see it." Grath set the page down. "How fast can you scale?" he said. And that was when Vivian Mercer opened her portfolio and got to work. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. She walked him through everything: the supply chain architecture she had built with the Laramie wholesaler, the wagon capacity and route optimization, the production volume she could achieve with existing equipment, and what would be required to scale further. She answered every question he put to her with the precision of someone who has been preparing for those exact questions without knowing they were coming, which is only possible if you have done the work thoroughly enough that you've already asked yourself every question worth asking. Gideon sat beside her and said almost nothing, which was exactly right. Twice Grath addressed a question to him, and twice Gideon answered briefly and then turned the conversation back to her without making it look deliberate. She noted it. She appreciated it more than she could have said in that room. At the 2-hour mark, Grath called in his operations manager, a brisk woman named Helen Ferris, who carried a ledger and had the expression of someone who has spent years finding the holes in other people's proposals. Helen Ferris asked 17 questions in 40 minutes. Vivian answered all 17 without consulting her notes, because the notes were there for other people's benefit. She already knew everything in them. When Ferris finished, she said to Grath without looking at Vivian, "The cost structure is better than we're currently paying Wyoming Central's supplier for the southern route, and that's before the productivity argument." Grath nodded. Then he looked at Vivian and said, "I need to speak with my legal team before we go to contract. There's a question of whether formalizing this relationship creates exposure given the Voss situation." Her stomach dropped, not in panic, but in the way of someone who has calculated a risk and now has to live inside the calculation. "How long?" she said. 24 hours. She breathed out. "All right. Stay in Laramie," he said. "I'll send word to your hotel." She and Gideon found a hotel 2 streets from the Pacific Meridian office. It was not a fine hotel, but it was clean and warm, and the beds were real, which was more than the road had offered. They ate supper in the dining room, mostly in silence, the productive silence of 2 people who have said everything necessary and are now simply waiting, which is its own kind of work. "You were extraordinary in there," Gideon said at some point. She shook her head. "I was prepared," she said. "It's not the same thing." "It is," he said, "when most people aren't." She looked at him. She thought about what he had said on the wagon road. "Whatever it was before you came here, that's not what it is now." And she thought about all the ways that was true, and all the ways she was still learning exactly what it meant. "Try to sleep," she said. "One of us has to be rested for whatever comes next." She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and ran scenarios. Yes, no conditional yes. With limiting clauses. A yes that came with requirements she couldn't meet. She examined each one, worked out the response, set it aside. She was not anxious exactly. She was running a machine inside her own mind, and the machine did not stop for darkness or exhaustion. At 4 in the morning, she gave up pretending and lit the lamp and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote, "What does Pacific Meridian need that nobody else can give them right now?" She answered the question the way she always answered her own questions, thoroughly, without self-pity, without wishful thinking. What they needed was speed. Their northern route broke ground in spring, which was 4 months away. To have a functional supply infrastructure in place. By then they needed someone who was already operational, already had supplier relationships, already understood the specific conditions of Wyoming construction camp feeding. Starting from scratch would cost them time they didn't have, and money they'd rather spend on track. What they needed was accountability. Voss's subsidiary had been delivering minimum compliance on Wyoming Central's camps for 2 years, and the productivity data she had just placed in front of Samuel Grath demonstrated exactly what minimum compliance cost in real human labor terms. They needed someone who treated the work as if it mattered. What they needed was someone Voss couldn't easily control. And here, she had to be honest with herself, she was not beyond his reach. He had just demonstrated that by shutting down her Wyoming Central access in a single morning. But she was harder to control than an anonymous supply company, because she had relationships. She had a legal case in motion, and she was not carrying debt to anyone in his network. She stared at the page. Then she wrote, "He'll try to get to Grath." She had been circling that thought for 12 hours. Voss would find out about the Pacific Meridian meeting he probably already knew, because men like Voss had their eyes in most places that mattered in Wyoming. And his move, if he was fast and decisive, which he was, she had already established, that would be to approach Pacific Meridian's leadership before the contract was signed and plant whatever seeds of doubt or complication would cause them to hesitate. She did not know if he'd be successful. She did not know how much influence Voss had in Pacific Meridian's organization, whether he had relationships there, whether he was positioned to interfere at the level that mattered. She had spent 2 months learning his architecture, but she had not mapped it in that direction. She did know one thing: 24 hours was not very long. She closed the notebook. She put out the lamp. She lay in the dark and told herself to rest, even if she couldn't sleep, because a body running on nothing becomes a liability, and she could not afford to be a liability tomorrow. She got 2 hours. Gideon knocked on her door at 7. His face told her immediately that something had happened. "Ryder came from the Pacific Meridian office," he said. "They want us over there at 8. "That's not 24 hours, she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She dressed quickly. She did not let herself decide what the accelerated timeline meant, because it could mean good or bad, with equal probability, and speculation served nothing. She picked up her portfolio. She checked that she had everything. She put on her coat. The walk to the Pacific Meridian office took 8 minutes. She counted them. Grath was standing when they came in, which she registered as different from yesterday. Ferris was there again. And there was a third person, a man she didn't recognize, older, with the quality of someone whose presence in a room changes the room's gravity. "Mrs. Mercer," Grath said, "I'd like you to meet Arthur Clemens. He's our regional director. He came in from Denver this morning." Her mind ran the calculation instantly. A regional director does not travel from Denver in response to a routine contract decision. He travels when the decision has become more significant than routine. She shook Clemens's hand. He had the careful eyes of a man who has survived a long career by reading people faster than they read him. "Sit down, please," he said. They sat. Clemens looked at her proposal, which was now in front of him, in addition to Grath. He had his own annotations on his copy, different handwriting, different colored pencil. "Mr. Grath briefed me last night," he said. "I had questions that required I come see this myself." He placed one hand flat on the proposal. "We have a situation I want you to understand before we proceed. R. Harlan Voss contacted our Denver operations VP at 7 o'clock last evening." Vivian did not move. Beside her, she felt Gideon go very still. "He's proposing," Clemens continued, "to offer Pacific Meridian an integrated supply and land access arrangement for our northern Wyoming route. He's representing that he controls sufficient land parcels along our proposed track to create right-of-way complications if we don't come to a preferred arrangement with his interests." The room was very quiet. "He mentioned you by name," Clemens said to Vivian. "He characterized your operation as an unsecured, legally compromised arrangement that would create liability for any company that formalized it." She looked at Clemens steadily. "What did your VP say?" "He said he'd need to look into it." Clemens paused. "Which is why I'm here and not in Denver." He looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention of a man who has decided to make a judgment call and wants to make it with the clearest possible information. "I want to hear your response to his characterization, not the version in your letter, the direct version." She breathed in once, slow, even. The legally compromised claim refers to the fact that my husband's ranch carries a loan note that Voss controls, she said. He structured that loan with a fraudulent interest clause that Clarence Adler in Laramie is currently building a case on. That case will likely be joined by claims from multiple other properties, which means it isn't a private dispute between one ranch and one lender. It's a pattern of fraud, and the documentation exists. She paused. Voss is hoping you'll see the legal complexity and pull back because it's simpler to avoid the situation than to examine it. That's the same logic he applies to every property he targets. People don't look closely because looking closely takes time, and time has a cost, and it's easier to walk away. She put both hands flat on the table. I'm asking you to look closely, because what you'll find is that the liability runs in his direction, not mine. Clemens looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Grath. Something passed between them that she couldn't fully read, some compressed conversation of the kind people who have worked together a long time learn to have in the span of a glance. Then Clemens said, "Tell me about your production capacity for a route serving 14 camps simultaneously." And Vivian understood that they had already made the decision. They just needed to hear her confirm that she could do what the paper said she could do. She talked for 40 minutes. She did not flinch from the hard numbers, what she could not do yet, what would require additional wagons, what the ramp-up timeline looked like, and where the risks were in that timeline. She gave him the conservative version and the realistic version, and told him which was which, because a man who had just tested her honesty would notice if she stopped being honest when the numbers got complicated. At the end, Clemens said, "The right-of-way claim Voss is making, is it real?" Grath answered that one. "Our survey team flagged 3 of the parcels he's referencing as potentially contested 6 weeks ago. We've been building around them. His leverage is thinner than he's representing." Clemens nodded. He looked at Vivian. "We're going to offer you a contract," he said. "Exclusive supply rights for all Pacific Meridian construction camps on the northern Wyoming route, beginning with the first active camps in March. The terms will be specific about volume commitments, delivery schedules, and quality standards, and they'll be enforced." His voice was direct and even. "If you don't perform, we cancel. If you do, we expand. Those are the conditions. Do you accept them?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without performance, just the word. "My legal team will have draft terms to you by Friday," he said. "I'll have my attorney review them," she said. "Clarence Adler." Clemens smiled, small but real. "I know Adler. Good choice." Outside the Pacific Meridian office on the cold Laramie Street, Gideon stood beside her and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. She could see him trying to find the right words and finding the territory too large for ordinary language. Finally he said, "You did that." She thought about whether to argue the point and decided against it. "We have a lot of work to do before March," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, not the pressed-down careful sound she'd heard in the first weeks. Open and uncalculated. She looked at him when he laughed because it changed his face entirely, and she filed that change in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered more than she'd fully acknowledged. "All right," he said. "Let's go home." The drive back to Harlan's Creek was not silent. It was the first long wagon ride where they talked. Actually talked, not transacted information or negotiated terms, but talked the way two people talk, when the emergency has lifted enough to let the ordinary back in. He told her about his father, about the ranch in its good years, about what it had felt like to watch it contract and fail and not know how to stop it. She told him about Columbus, about her father's ledger books, about the particular loneliness of being competent in ways that the people around you cannot see because they've already decided who you are. "I decided who you were the moment I saw you at that stage office," he said. He said it quietly, with the specific gravity of a man choosing not to flinch from his own history. "I know," she said. "I was wrong." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Does it still—" He stopped. Tried again. "Does it still hurt, being seen that way?" She considered the question honestly. It stopped mattering when I was too busy to let it matter, she said, which was approximately my second day here. She paused. But yes, it hurt. He nodded. She could feel him absorbing that, not defending himself against it, just holding it. That mattered. That was the specific thing that mattered most. They arrived at the ranch as the light was going. Cal and Everett were in the yard, and both of them looked at the wagon coming in with the careful posture of men who had been waiting without wanting to look like they were waiting. She climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped, and Cal said immediately, "Well, we need to hire 2 more drivers," she said, "and I need you to contact the Laramie wholesaler by telegraph tomorrow morning and tell them to double our standing order starting in February." Cal stared at her. Then he grabbed his hat off his head and said something she didn't quite hear, but that Everett apparently found very funny, because Everett, silent, unflappable Everett, who had been driving wagons without complaint since the 2nd month and had never once expressed an opinion about the operation's prospects, broke into a grin so wide it rearranged his entire face. Vivian went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened her notebook. She had been keeping this notebook since her first week on the ranch. Every number, every foreman's name, every route, every calculation, every plan. It was nearly full. She ran her hand over the current page and thought about how much had been decided on this table, in this kitchen, in the space between what she'd had and what she'd needed. Then she wrote in her small, even handwriting at the top of a new page, Pacific Meridian contract. Exclusive. 14 camps. March start. She underlined it once. She thought about Voss, about him sitting in Denver waiting for word from his contact in Pacific Meridian, waiting to hear that she had been characterized correctly, that the liability argument had held that the woman who had been cutting into his camp supply arrangements had been quietly sidelined by a well-placed call from a well-positioned man. She thought about the moment he would learn that it hadn't worked. She thought about what that moment would look like for him, the geometry of it. Then she thought about something else. The Adler case. The fraud documentation. The pattern across multiple properties that Adler had been building toward for 3 months. She picked up her pen. She wrote Adler's name at the top of a separate page. She wrote the words, "Voss moved against Pacific Meridian directly. He is escalating. Accelerate filing timeline." She would send that letter in the morning, because the Pacific Meridian contract protected the ranch's revenue. But the Adler case was something different. Something that could protect the other ranches, the ones that didn't have a Vivian Mercer at their kitchen table with a notebook and a plan. The ones that were still inside the machine, slowly being ground down, with no one looking closely enough to see what was happening to them. She had told Clemens, people don't look closely because looking closely takes time. She had been talking about Voss's strategy. But she was aware in the quiet of the kitchen that she had chosen to look closely. She had always chosen that. And now she had the standing to do something with what she saw. She wrote until the lamp oil was low. She outlined the additional evidence she could provide Adler, the timeline of Voss's approach to Pacific Meridian, which demonstrated that his interference was not incidental, but coordinated and deliberate, which might strengthen the fraud argument by showing a continuing pattern of behavior rather than isolated transactions. When she finally closed the notebook, it was deep night. The kitchen was cold. She sat for a moment in the dark with her hands around an empty coffee cup, not thinking about anything in particular, which was rare enough that she noticed it. She heard Gideon in the hallway, the particular quiet of someone checking on something before they sleep. He pushed the door open. "You're still up." "Just finished," she said. He came in and sat across from her in the dark. Neither of them lit the lamp. There was enough moonlight through the window to see by. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes after March, after the contract is running and the debt is cleared and we're past the Voss situation." He looked at her. "What do you want, Vivian? Not for the ranch, for yourself." She had not been asked that question in so long that it took her a moment to understand it was being asked. "I want this," she said. "I want to build something that lasts. Something that doesn't depend on any one contract or any one man's goodwill. Something with enough mass and momentum that even if everything went wrong tomorrow, the infrastructure would survive it. She paused. I want to never again be in the position of having one point of failure. He was quiet. That sounds like a lifetime of work. Yes, she said. Good, he said. And the word was so simple and so complete that she looked at him sharply, and he met her eyes in the dark and said, I'm saying I want a lifetime to be part of it, if that's something you want. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had not tipped his hat at a stage office in Harlan's Creek. The man who had said nothing while his hands mocked her, and then came to the table 3 weeks later and asked what she needed. The man who had sat beside her for 3 hours in Samuel Grath's office and twice turned questions back to her without making it look deliberate, because somewhere in the last 3 months he had understood something important about what it means to stand beside a person instead of in front of them. Ask me again in March, she said. When the first wagons go out on the Pacific Meridian route and the numbers are real and there's nothing urgent to deal with. Why March? Because I want to answer you when I'm not in the middle of something, she said. And I'm always in the middle of something. He smiled. She could see it even in the dark. All right, he said. March. He stood. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed. Not asking for anything, not performing anything, just the warmth of a hand on a shoulder in a dark kitchen on a night when everything was still possible. She heard him go down the hall. She heard his door close. She sat alone in the dark kitchen for a while longer. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the grass, and the stars were very bright, and somewhere to the south in the camps, she had built her first operation. Men were asleep in their bunks after eating food that had been made with genuine attention by someone who understood that a fed man is a different man than a hungry one. She would be back in those camps eventually, not through Wyoming Central, through something cleaner, something she owned, something that could not be taken from her by a policy change from a management level she had no access to. She was patient. She had always been patient, not with her own ambitions, but with the pace at which the world was willing to accommodate them. She picked up the notebook one more time, opened it to the last clean page. She wrote, "What Voss doesn't understand is that he didn't stop me. He reorganized me." She underlined it, closed the book. In 6 weeks, the Pacific Meridian contract would be signed. In 4 months, the first wagons would roll on the northern route. In 8 months, the Wyoming Central camps would hear through the foreman network that Vivian Mercer's operation was running again, bigger and better, and entirely out of Voss's reach, and the foremen who had been forced to turn her away would find ways to reach her because they remembered what real food tasted like, and they had not forgotten. But that was later. Right now there was tomorrow, and tomorrow there was a telegraph to send to Adler, and a wholesale order to double, and a ranch that had against every probability survived to see another winter. She was not done. She was just getting started. The Pacific Meridian contract arrived on a Friday, and it was 41 pages long. Vivian read every word. She read it twice with Adler's responding notes beside her, which he had sent by telegraph relay in abbreviated form, and then followed up with a full letter that arrived 3 days later. She read the sections Adler flagged. She read the sections he hadn't flagged, because those sometimes contained the things people were hoping you wouldn't examine. She made notes in the margins of her own copy in her small, even handwriting. And when she was done, she had 7 questions that needed clarification before she would sign. She sent those questions to Pacific Meridian's legal team by telegraph on a Monday morning. They came back answered by Wednesday afternoon. 5 of the 7 were resolved to her satisfaction. The other 2 required a redrafted clause, which Grath's team produced by Friday. She signed on a Saturday. Gideon signed beside her as co-owner of the ranch operation. She watched their names go down on the paper side by side and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph, not relief, though there was some of both. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing behind you in a good way. The feeling of a decision made so completely that there is no part of your mind left arguing about it. Adler witnessed the signing. He had ridden out from Laramie specifically, which told her how much the contract mattered in his estimation. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 50s who spoke precisely and moved carefully the way men move when they've spent decades in rooms where imprecision has consequences. He shook her hand after the signatures were done and said, "You understand this changes your position in the Voss case." "How so?" she said. "You now have a formalized business relationship with a major railroad company," he said. "That relationship has legal standing. It can be damaged by Voss's ongoing interference, which means his actions are no longer just affecting a private ranch operation, they're potentially impacting a commercial contract with an interstate railroad. The damages calculation changes significantly." She looked at him. "You're saying we have more leverage." "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that the case I'm building just got considerably larger than I initially planned for." She nodded. She had thought about this in the days between signing and today, about what the Adler case could become versus what it had started as. It had started as a defense of one ranch, a man named Adler with a pencil and a ledger full of irregular loan documents, and a client who had by sheer determination refused to be foreclosed on quietly. But Voss had not been content to let it stay small. He had gone to Denver. He had called a VP at Pacific Meridian at 7 in the evening. He had tried to use his reach to collapse what she was building, which meant he had brought his full architecture into the light, and what was in the light could be mapped. "How many properties are we talking about now?" she said. "7 confirmed," Adler said. 2 more under examination. All of them carrying loan structures with the same fraudulent compounding clause through companies traceable to Voss's holding entity. He paused. 6 of the 7 ranches have already lost their properties through foreclosure. The owners are scattered, some left Wyoming altogether. Finding them and getting statements will take time. "But it's possible," she said. "It's possible," he said. She thought about those 6 ranches. 6 families who had done what Gideon had done, worked honestly, believed in straightforward dealing, taken a loan from a company that looked legitimate, and turned out to be a machine. She thought about what it would have meant to have someone looking closely in time, before the foreclosure, before the dispersal. She thought about the fact that she had been close to being the 7th. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. "To find those families." Adler looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent a career defending people and is not accustomed to clients who ask how they can help beyond their own case. "Time," he said. "And potentially some of your contacts in the county clerk offices. You seem to have developed a talent for extracting useful information from official records." "I'll write you a list of names," she said. January moved fast. It always does when you have enough work to fill it, and Vivian had more than enough. The Pacific Meridian contract required preparation that made her 2-month buildup of the Wyoming Central operation look modest by comparison. 14 camps, a spring groundbreaking. A workforce that would eventually number over 600 men as construction intensified through summer. She needed to triple her production capacity, establish a secondary supplier relationship in addition to her Laramie wholesaler for redundancy, and hire 4 more drivers who could be trained to her standards before the first wagon rolled on the northern route. She hired the drivers through Everett, who had opinions about wagon handling that were more exacting than her own, and applied them without mercy during the training runs. 2 of the 4 candidates washed out in the first week. The 2 who remained, a young man named Davis, who was 19 and terrifyingly competent, and a former Army supply driver named Rosa, who was the first woman Vivian had hired and who handled a fully loaded wagon on rough terrain with a calm efficiency that Vivian recognized immediately as her own, became the core of the expanded team. Cal managed the logistics side with the particular competence of someone who has found the work that fits them and stopped fighting it. He was not the same man who had made a livestock comment in a ranch yard months ago. She was aware of that transformation and aware that she was not fully responsible for it. People change in the direction they're already capable of going, and Cal had always been capable of this. He had just needed a context where it was required. She told him that directly one morning when he had solved a route scheduling problem that she had been turning over for 2 days without resolution. You could manage a supply operation of your own, she said. If you wanted to. He looked surprised. Then he looked like he was trying not to look surprised, which was more honest. I'm fine where I am, he said. I know, she said. I'm telling you it's an option. For later if things change. He nodded slowly. Turned the idea over in some private room behind his eyes. Then, you always thinking about later? Always, she said. He went back to the scheduling. But she could see that the conversation had done something not immediately actionable, but real. She had learned that the most important things you say to people are often the ones that don't produce an immediate response. They produce something slower and more durable. February brought two things. The first below-zero stretch of winter that made the pre-dawn production runs genuinely punishing, and a letter from Clarence Adler that changed the shape of everything. He had found 4 of the 6 displaced ranch families. 2 were still in Wyoming, 1 in Cheyenne, 1 outside Casper. 2 had gone east, 1 to Nebraska, and 1 to Ohio. All 4 had documentation. All 4 were willing to provide statements. And one of them, a man named Harold Pruitt, who had lost a cattle ranch north of Laramie 2 years prior, had in the process of clearing out, after foreclosure, kept a copy of a letter from the loan company that contained language explicitly acknowledging the interest rate structure in terms that Adler believed constituted written confirmation of intent to deceive. The letter from Harold Pruitt was in Adler's careful legal language, the most significant piece of evidentiary documentation I have encountered in this investigation. Vivian read that letter from Adler 3 times. Then she sat for a while at the kitchen table, doing nothing which was still unusual enough that Gideon noticed. What happened? He said. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face move through the sequence comprehension, then the particular quiet of someone absorbing something that is simultaneously good news and the confirmation of something ugly. This means Adler can file, he said. This means Adler can file and have a real chance, she said. There's a difference. He set the letter down. He looked at her. Voss is going to know when the filing happens. Yes. He'll retaliate. He'll try, she said. But his options are narrowing. He's already played his Wyoming Central card. He tried the Pacific Meridian angle and failed. He can't foreclose on us because we're about to clear the note. She paused. He can make noise. He can use lawyers to slow things down. But slowing things down is different from stopping them, and Adler knows that territory better than Voss's attorneys do. Gideon looked at the letter again, at Harold Pruitt's name, at the families behind all of it. These people lost everything, he said. Yes, she said. Because of the same system that almost took this ranch. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What can we do? She had been thinking about that since the letter arrived. The 2 families still in Wyoming, I'd like to meet with them. Not as witnesses for Adler's case, as people. They lost land and livestock in years. The legal case may produce some remedy, but legal remedies are slow and complicated and don't cover everything. She paused. I have a Pacific Meridian contract that needs reliable suppliers and additional transportation resources as we scale. I have a growing operation that can offer consistent work. I'm not in a position to repair what happened to them, but I might be in a position to offer something going forward. Gideon looked at her for a long time. You're building something bigger than a food operation, he said. I'm trying to build something that has enough weight to matter, she said. A food operation is the mechanism. That's not the same as the purpose. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had in January, quietly, without declaration. She held his hand, and they sat with that for a moment in the kitchen, that had been the center of everything at the table, that had seen every plan and every crisis, and every late-night accounting of what was possible and what wasn't. You said March, he said. She looked at him. You told me to ask again in March, he said. When the first wagons go out, and the numbers are real, and there's nothing urgent. His eyes were direct and steady. It's going to be March in 3 weeks, Vivian. She felt something move in her chest. Not urgency, not panic, but the particular warmth of something true being said plainly. "I know," she said. "So I'm asking now," he said. "Not for an answer. I'm just reminding you that I meant it, that I'm still asking." She looked at him. Really looked the way she looked at things she needed to understand completely. She saw the man who had stood in a doorway on a Wyoming night and told her whatever it was before you came here, that's not what it is now. She saw the man who had sat beside her in Samuel Grath's office and said nothing for 3 hours because he understood instinctively and completely that the room needed her voice and not his. She saw the man who had asked her in a cold wagon on the road to Laramie what she wanted, not what the operation needed, not what the ranch required, but what she wanted for herself, and had listened to the answer like it mattered. "March," she said. And the way she said it was not a postponement. It was a date. He smiled. She squeezed his hand once and let go because there was work to do, and she had always been a woman who did the work. The first Pacific Meridian wagons rolled out on the 4th of March before the sun was fully up on roads that were cold and clear after a week of thaw. Vivian drove the lead wagon herself. She had not planned to. She had trained drivers who could handle the route, and a dozen operational reasons to stay at the ranch and manage the logistics from the center. But she had decided the night before that some things require the person responsible to be present for their beginning. Davis drove the second wagon. Rosa drove the third. 2 more followed behind. 5 wagons total on the inaugural run, more than she had ever run simultaneously, more than she had believed possible in the first weeks when she had 1 wagon and a single doubtful camp foreman named Patrick Doyle. The first Pacific Meridian camp was run by a foreman named Jim Aldridge, who had been briefed by his railroad management and was waiting for them with the careful, watchful expression of a man who has heard things described and is now judging whether the description is accurate. She climbed down. She unloaded the first crate herself, not to make a point, but because it was her operation, and the first delivery of a new contract deserved that kind of attention. Aldridge looked at the food. He looked at her. He picked up a biscuit, bit into it, and was quiet for a moment. "This is real," he said. She recognized the words. "Camp 5 months ago, the young man with the bandaged hand. I heard about her food. They said it was real. She had thought then that she understood what it meant. She understood it better now, understood that what these men were hungry for was not just calories, but evidence that someone had considered them worth the effort. "It's real," she said. "And it'll be here on schedule every delivery until your route is done. You have my word on that." Aldridge nodded. "Then we'll have a good spring," he said. She drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon with the certainty of a woman whose word has just been given on something she intends to keep. The sky was big and clean, and the Wyoming grass was starting to show the first uncertain green of early spring. She had her notebook on the seat beside her, and she had been adding to it at each stop: foreman names, camp sizes, specific preferences she had observed or been told, the particular character of each site that would inform how she calibrated the supplies going forward. Gideon was in the yard when she came in. He looked at her face before she had said anything and said, "It went well." "It went exactly as it should have," she said. He helped her unhitch the horses, which was something he had started doing quietly in February without anyone commenting on it. She noticed. She didn't comment on it either. 2 weeks later, Adler filed. The filing landed in the Laramie Territorial Court on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, word had reached Harlan's Creek through the reliable machinery of small-town information, which moves faster than telegraph when the news is sufficiently interesting. The case named Voss's Holding Company as primary defendant and cited fraud under Wyoming territorial law. It named 9 properties. It carried the testimony of 4 displaced families and the documentary evidence of Harold Pruitt's preserved letter. It was in Adler's considered view, which he expressed to Vivian in a brief note accompanying the filed copy, he sent her the strongest fraud case he had brought in 20 years of practice. Voss's attorneys responded within 4 days with a motion to dismiss. Adler had anticipated this and had written his filing specifically to survive it. The motion failed. The second motion, filed 2 weeks later, sought to delay discovery proceedings. It also failed. Voss himself was quiet through this. No more representatives in expensive coats. No more calls to railroad VPs. She had half expected a direct approach, some version of the meeting they'd had in her kitchen, stretched into its final confrontational form. But he didn't come. She thought about why, and she concluded that men like Voss did not make personal appearances when they were losing. They operated through systems and intermediaries, and when the systems were failing and the intermediaries were not producing results, they became invisible. Not because they were retreating, because they were regrouping, calculating, looking for the angle. She kept looking for it too. The note on the ranch came due in the second week of March, as it always had, as it had been hanging over this property for 3 years. She paid it in full, the principal plus the last standard rate interest payment, excluding the fraudulent compounding which Adler had formally contested as part of the case, and which the court had issued a temporary suspension on, while the fraud claim was adjudicated. The receipt came back from the loan company's Wyoming office with a stamp on it that she looked at for a long time. Paid in full. The specific words. She folded it carefully and put it in the notebook. Not the current one, which was almost full, but the original one she had started in her first week on the ranch, which she had kept in the bottom of her suitcase all this time, because she was not a sentimental woman generally, but she understood that some things should be preserved. That evening she did something she had not done in months. She sat on the porch without her notebook and without anything to do, and let the Wyoming evening happen around her. The spring air was cool, but not cold anymore, and the sky went through its colors the way it does in that country, extravagant and unapologetic, as if it has decided to mean it. Gideon came out and sat beside her. He had 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. They sat for a while without talking. "The note is cleared," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw the receipt." "The Pacific Meridian route is running on schedule. All 14 camps confirmed for spring volume." "I know that too," he said. "The Adler case is moving, slowly but forward." "Vivian," he said. She looked at him. "Nothing is urgent right now," he said. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still tight. He was right. For this specific evening, in this specific moment, nothing was on fire, and nothing was failing, and nothing required immediate calculation. She was sitting on a porch she had not burned down in the spring air of a ranch that was not being foreclosed on, beside a man who had asked her a question in February and waited for March. It was March. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes, what?" "You know what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him absorbing it, the word, the context, the clean simplicity of it, landing in the space where the question had been waiting. Then he reached over and took her hand, the way he had before, quietly, without theater. She held it, the way she had before. But the silence between them was different this time. It had a different quality. It was not the silence of 2 people managing a crisis together. It was the silence of 2 people who have come through a crisis and are beginning to understand what they are to each other on the other side of it. "I want to make this legal," he said. "Properly. Not the contract. Us." She considered that. "We are already legally married," she said. "You know what I mean," he said. She did. She looked at the sky, at the extravagant Wyoming dusk, and she thought about what he meant, and what it would mean, and what she would be agreeing to, and she found that she did not need very much time to think about it, because she had been in the honest part of herself thinking about it since January. "All right," she said. He tightened his hand around hers. She let him. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, which in Wyoming takes a while and is worth waiting for. The summer that followed was the hardest working summer of her life, which was considerable competition. The Pacific Meridian route expanded in June as construction crews pushed further west, and 2 additional camps came online ahead of schedule. She added a 3rd supplier relationship in June and a 6th wagon in July. Rosa turned out to have a talent for route optimization that was distinct from Vivian's own. She thought spatially, where Vivian thought sequentially, and together they produced scheduling solutions that neither would have reached alone. Vivian promoted her to route manager without ceremony, and Rosa accepted without ceremony, which was the correct way for two practical women to handle a thing. Word traveled as it always had. Not just through the Foreman network now, through the broader Wyoming supply community, through the railroad contractor circles, through the county clerk offices, where Vivian had spent months cultivating the kind of relationships that produce useful information in both directions. She received 3 inquiries in June from other railroad lines with Wyoming operations asking about supply arrangements. She answered 2 of them with exploratory letters and declined the third because the terms were not adequate, and she had learned somewhere in the process of building this operation that she did not need to accept inadequate terms. The Voss case moved through its deliberate legal rhythms. There was a hearing in July that Adler described as significant, then a delay in August that he described as routine, then a development in September that was neither. Harold Pruitt came to Laramie in September to give his deposition. Adler had warned her it would happen, but she had not planned to be there. It was Adler's case. She was a supporting witness, not a principal, and the September wagon schedules were complex enough that she'd have been hard-pressed to get away. But something made her go. She asked Gideon to cover the ranch end and drove to Laramie herself on a Tuesday. Pruitt was 63, built wide and weathered with the hands of a man who had worked cattle his whole life, and the eyes of someone who has processed a significant loss and come out the other side carrying the shape of it. He shook her hand when Adler introduced them, and he held it for a moment, not dramatically, just with the particular grip of someone who wants to communicate something that he doesn't have the exact words for. "You're the one who started this," he said. "Mr. Adler started it," she said. "Adler found me because of you," Pruitt said. "I know how these things work, Mrs. Mercer. Someone decided it was worth looking. That's you." She didn't argue the point. She looked at him, at Harold Pruitt, who had kept a letter that most people would have burned or discarded, or simply not recognized as significant, because most people don't know that a piece of paper that seems like ordinary correspondence can contain the geometry of someone's deliberate wrongdoing. "I'm glad the letter was there," she said. "My wife told me to keep everything he said. She always said paper remembers better than people do." He was quiet for a moment. "She passed 2 years ago, before I could tell her that she was right." Vivian said nothing. She held the weight of that with him for a moment. "I'll go in there and say what happened," he said. "All of it. The loan, the letters, the foreclosure. I'll say it clearly." He looked at her. "Are there others like me?" "6 confirmed," she said. "Adler is in contact with 4 of them. The other 2 were still looking." He nodded. "If you find them," he said, "tell them Harold Pruitt says it's worth saying out loud. Even if it doesn't fix everything, it's still worth saying." She drove back to the ranch that evening with Pruitt's words sitting in her mind. Paper remembers better than people do. And she thought about her notebook, about the ledgers, about the loan documents. She had read 6 times and underlined 11 clauses. In about the letter, she had spent a long night writing to Samuel Grath in precise sequential language that had produced a meeting and then a contract and then an operation that was now feeding over 600 men daily and showing no signs of stopping. Paper remembered. She had always known that. It was why she wrote everything down. The Voss ruling came in November. Adler sent a rider, not a telegram. A rider which told her before she read a word that the news required the kind of delivery that puts a face to information. She was in the middle of a production run when the rider arrived, and she kept working for the 4 minutes it took to finish the current batch, because she had learned that operations do not pause for news, and news should not panic operations. Then she wiped her hands, took the letter, read it. The territorial court had found in favor of the plaintiffs on the primary fraud claim. Voss's holding company was ordered to pay damages to the 7 plaintiff ranches, including the Hale Ranch, calculated from the point of the fraudulent loan origination. The fraudulent interest structure was ruled void. The foreclosures on 5 of the 6 previously lost properties were subject to a separate remediation proceeding that would take additional months, but that Adler, in his careful language, described as having a strong likely outcome. At the bottom of the letter, Adler had written, without his usual professional economy, "You did this. I want you to know that." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the production run because there were 400 portions of cornbread that needed to be ready before dawn, and an empire did not pause for its own victories. Later after the run, after the wagons were loaded and the kitchen was clean and the ranch had settled into its evening, she sat at the kitchen table and told Gideon. She told him the full ruling, the damages calculation, what it meant for the note they'd already paid, and what additional remedy they might receive. She told him about the 5 foreclosed properties and what the remediation proceeding could mean for those families. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Pruitt's wife was right." "About paper," she said. "About paper," he said. She went to find the original notebook, the one in the bottom of the suitcase, the one that started in her first week. She brought it to the table. She opened it to the first page, where she had written her initial inventory of the larder, 1 barrel of flour half full. Salt pork insufficient. Dried beans, 1 week's worth. She turned to the last page she had written in. The last entry, made the morning she drove the first Pacific Meridian wagons, read, "First delivery complete. Aldridge says good spring." He's right. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date November 1882, and then she wrote Voss ruling fraud confirmed. 7 ranches. Damages ordered. The note is clear. The route is running. The case is won. The empire is real. She closed the notebook. Gideon was watching her from across the table. "What does it feel like?" he said. "When you write it down like that?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things, without decoration, without the performance of feeling. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a single brown suitcase and a marriage contract she'd agreed to out of necessity, who had walked into a dying kitchen and made a decision not to die with it. She thought about the laughter in the yard, about the livestock comment, about the empty wagons and the doubtful foreman, and the pre-dawn mornings that had seemed in the beginning like survival and had turned out to be architecture. "It feels like arithmetic," she said. "Like a column of numbers that finally adds up to what you knew it should." He smiled. She looked at his smile and felt the particular warmth of a woman who has built something true and has someone beside her who understands what it cost. Outside, the Wyoming winter was beginning its annual renegotiation with the landscape cold, coming in hard from the north, the grass going brittle, the sky that particular iron gray that preceded snow. Somewhere to the south, the Wyoming Central camps were moving into their winter schedules. Somewhere to the north, the Pacific Meridian route was making progress despite the cold, because construction does not fully stop for winter when there is a deadline, and there is always a deadline. And in those northern camps, 600 men sat down to food that had been made with genuine attention by someone who had understood from her very first delivery that the difference between minimum compliance and actual care is not a philosophical distinction. It is a measurable, documentable, real-world outcome that shows up in productivity figures and in the faces of men who have been given something worth eating. The wagons would run tomorrow, and the day after, and through the winter and into the next spring when the Pacific Meridian route would expand again, and she would need an 8th wagon and probably a 9th and a storage facility in Laramie, and a second route manager, and a meeting with Grath about the following year's contract terms. She was already thinking about all of it. She was always thinking about all of it. She reached for her current notebook, not the old one, the working one, and opened it to a fresh page. Gideon watched her with the expression she had come to recognize as his specific affection for this particular habit, the way a person looks at something in someone they love that is entirely that person's own and would not be changed for anything. She wrote Spring 1883, Route Expansion, 8th Wagon, Laramie Facility, Route Manager Search. Then she wrote underneath it, in the same small, even handwriting that had recorded every number and every plan and every hard-won piece of ground from the very beginning. Next year bigger. The year after bigger still. She put the pen down. She looked at what she had written. Vivian Mercer had arrived in Harlan's Creek with a single suitcase, a borrowed contract, and nothing that the world around her was willing to recognize as useful. She had been mocked for her body and dismissed for her gender, and written off by a man who had built 3 years of careful predatory architecture around the assumption that people like her would eventually stop fighting and let themselves be absorbed into failure. He had been wrong about every single part of that. She had not survived Wyoming. She had claimed it one camp at a time, one foreman at a time, one delivery at a time, one early morning and one late night, and one notebook page at a time, until the thing she had built was too large and too real and too deeply rooted in the actual work of actual people's lives to be moved by any man's interference or any system's contempt. The ranch would survive this winter. The wagons would run their routes through cold and wind and everything Wyoming had to offer, because they had been running through cold and wind since the beginning and had not stopped yet. The men in the northern camps would eat well and work hard and go home at the end of the season to families who would see in them the particular dignity of people who have been properly cared for. And in the spring, when the ground thawed and the construction resumed, and the Pacific Meridian line pushed further west into territory that was still being mapped, Vivian Mercer's wagons would be there first, already in position, already known, already trusted, because trust is not given to operations that show up once. It is given to operations that show up every time. She had built that. She had built it from a half-empty flour barrel and a broken kitchen, and the absolute refusal to accept that what other people could not see in her was the final word on what she was. In the harshest land in America, in the hardest season of her life, in the face of a machine designed specifically to consume her and everything she might build, she did not just survive. She built an empire no one saw coming, and it fed 1,000 people, and it lasted.